Linda, and to Ms. Grace for organizing this also, and all the teachers who have invited me today to talk to you about something that's very dear to my heart. I'm here today for a couple of reasons. I belong to an organization called the Holocaust Speakers Bureau, and we go to schools and organizations around North Carolina and talk about the Holocaust to anyone who's willing to listen and learn. In the past, we used actual survivors of the Holocaust, and they would go out to the schools and were welcome. But the students, they would share their incredible personal stories with the students. Today, unfortunately, most of those survivors have passed away, or they're simply too frail to go out on speaking tours. So what we do is we send people like me, as second generation, we call ourselves 2Gs, and we are the children of Holocaust survivors, and we talk to you guys. Which brings me to the most important reason I'm here today. And that is, I am the daughter of parents who were among the very few fortunate to survive the Holocaust. I obviously would not be here today talking to you if I hadn't been born and if they hadn't survived. I feel it is my thank you. I feel it is my responsibility and my moral duty to tell their story to you. So I know that many of you, if not all of you, watched a video yesterday about the Holocaust, 20 minutes or so, and I hope you found that very interesting. I think I'm going to start just a quick refresher about what the Holocaust is. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution, deportation, and murder of 6 million men, women, and children who were Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. The Holocaust, the Nazis who came to power in Germany in 1933 believed that Germans were racially superior and that Jews, people of the Jewish religion, were inferior and an alien threat to the so-called German racial community. 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe were killed by the Nazis. My talk today is not so much a history lesson, although there is some of that in there, but it is the personal story of my parents in the Holocaust and some of our family members. Let me begin with a little background. Here are my parents as kids. Both of my parents were Jewish, born to Jewish parents and grandparents. My father was born in Poland in 1910, but his family moved to Berlin, Germany when he was a young boy. My mother was born in Berlin in 1913. Her parents were both born in Poland, but emigrated to Germany for better economic opportunities. So here is circled in red is a picture of my mother in high school in Berlin. Anti-Semitism, or prejudice against Jews, has been around for centuries in Europe, and it was very prominent in Germany as my parents were growing up. My mother told me that all through her schooling, she felt discrimination by her teachers because she was Jewish. Teachers would make fun of her and make remarks about the other Jewish children in the class. Can you imagine what it would be like if your teachers ridiculed you in front of your classes and held you out as being different from everyone else? Here are my parents in their 20s. This was taken sometime during the 1930s before the war. In 1935, the Nazis announced new laws, which were institutionalized, which institutionalized many of the cruel racial theories prevalent in Nazi ideology. They excluded German Jews from citizenship and prohibited them from marrying persons of German or related blood. Other ordinances took the vote away from Jews and deprived them of most of their political rights. The Nuremberg laws, as they became known, did not define a Jew as someone with a particular religious belief. Instead, anyone who had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was defined as a Jew, regardless of whether that individual identified himself or herself as a Jew or belonged to the Jewish religious community. Many Germans who had not practiced Judaism for years found themselves caught in the grip of Nazi terror. Even people with Jewish grandparents who had converted to Christianity were defined as Jews. My father did not come from a religious or observant Jewish family, but my mother did. But it did not make any difference to the Nazis. They were treated the same under the Nuremberg laws. My parents lived in Berlin after they were married, but it wasn't long after that wedding that the situation for the Jews in Germany and most of Europe went from bad to worse to unbearable. Kristallnacht, which is also referred to as the Night of Broken Glass, for the shattered glass that lined German streets from the windows of synagogues, homes, and Jewish-owned businesses. They were plundered and destroyed, and it was a wave of violent anti-Jewish attacks that took place on November 9th and 10th, 1938, throughout Germany and German-occupied Austria. Listen to some of these statistics from that, those 2 days. More than 1,600 synagogues, Jewish houses of worship, as I mentioned, were ransacked and 250 burned. 7,500 storefronts of Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated. At least 90 people were killed during the rampage, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to various concentration camps. While most of these were released over the next 3 months, on the condition that they begin the process of leaving Germany, they came home broken men. And then there were the hundreds who died in the camps as a result of the brutal treatment they endured. Kristallnacht marked the first instance in which the Nazi regime incarcerated Jews on a massive scale, simply on the basis of their ethnicity. The lack of response by the German people to these actions signaled to the Nazis that the public was prepared for more radical measures. Jews were removed entirely from German economic and social life. All Jewish students were permanently expelled from schools. It marked the beginning of Nazi policies of forced emigration and ultimately deportation of Jews to death camps. Whoops. It was also the turning point for my family. Here is a photo of my grandparents, Rosa and Simon, and my Uncle Arthur. I was named after my grandmother, Rosa. After Kristallnacht in 1938, Jews who had the resources or the connections tried to flee Germany. My mother's sister and one of her 2 brothers were able to escape Berlin before the window of opportunity closed in 1939. My aunt went to Palestine and my uncle to Argentina. My grandparents were older and in poor health and were not able to but my Uncle Arthur, who's shown in the photo, decided to stay with them to try and protect them. By the way, these are the only known photos I have of my grandparents and my uncle. In 1939, my grandparents and my uncle were deported back to Poland, where my grandparents were born, as I mentioned. That was the last time my mother ever saw her parents or her brother. We know they were likely killed sometime in 1941. I have a letter from them to my mother dated 1940, so even up until that time they were still alive. We never knew exactly how or where they died. But just recently, through an internet search, I came across some very disturbing information that most likely tells us how and where they were killed. In the fall of 1941, the Jews of Cilla, that's the name of the Polish town where they lived, were transferred to another town nearby and then were killed in the infamous forest of Kazamierz, Biskupi. This is the likely place that my grandparents were killed, although I'm not 100% certain. And I'm not sure where my uncle was killed, as I know he spent some time in Warsaw, Poland, and may have been sent to the Warsaw Ghetto and ultimately murdered. There are no records of any of their deaths. The plaque states in English and in Polish at this memorial: in this forest in the autumn of 1941, a special unit of the German SS murdered about 3,000 Jews by using exhaust fumes. At least one group of victims was killed when forced into a pit of lime. There is a first-hand account by a man who somehow survived this massacre, but the story of how some of these innocent Jews died there is really too terrible to discuss here tonight. Oh gosh. This is a photo of my great aunt Cilla. She was deported to Terezin concentration camp. It's also known as Theresienstadt in German, in what is now the Czech Republic. Terezin served a number of purposes, but it was primarily a camp ghetto or holding pen for Jews before they were sent to death camps. It was expected that the poor conditions there would hasten the deaths of the many deportees until the SS and police could deport the survivors to killing centers such as the Auschwitz concentration camp. Of the approximately 140,000 Jews transferred to Terezin, nearly 90,000 were deported to points further east and almost certain death. Roughly 33,000 died at Terezin itself, and it had its own crematorium on the grounds. I have visited Terezin and will never forget what I saw there. It is sickening to think that my great aunt suffered there for over 2 years, only to be sent to her death at Auschwitz in the end. And as you can see here, the Germans have the transport numbers listed. You can go online and find these things. It's astounding of how many were deported, how many were murdered, and you can see of the 100 deported, only 8 survived. And then the transport from Terezin to Auschwitz. My great aunt Johanna, after whom I was given my middle name, Joan, was sent on the same transport as her sister, my great aunt Cilla. Johanna was one of those who did not survive the conditions of Terezin and died before she could be transported with her sister to Auschwitz. These are the only known photos of my great aunts. Until recently, their stories had never been told before. perhaps one of the most heartbreaking family stories. This is the only photo of my father's sister, Marta, and her husband, Salo, and their little girl, Johanna, who was probably only around 12 when she and her parents were murdered by the Nazis. There is no information available on when or where they were killed. Sadly, there were many more relatives, not as closely related as those I've mentioned, who were also murdered by the Nazis, and there are no death records for them, and no one to tell their stories. I'll turn to my parents now. This is probably not the best photo to use for this slide, as it shows my mother with a big smile, and that's how I always remember her. But I can assure you, it was not a happy time for her. After the Nazis deported my mother's parents and brother to Poland in 1939, my parents made plans to escape to London, England, where my mother had an uncle who would sponsor her. She would not have been allowed into England if her uncle had not been there, as England had strict immigration quotas, and there were those in Parliament at the time who actively campaigned against admitting more Jews into the country, even though they knew they were facing great danger or death in Europe. For reasons not completely clear, my mother went on to London ahead of my dad. Unfortunately, war broke out in Germany, and the door closed on my father, who was trapped in Germany, and I'll get to his incredible story in a minute. My mom lived in London, excuse me, for the duration of the war. She never knew what happened to my father, or if he was even alive. She lived through terrible Nazi bombings in London and told me she spent many nights sleeping in the bomb shelters on the floor below the city. One funny story about my mother, if you can find some humor here. She told me that she had reported one day as a volunteer fire watcher, and those were people who stood on the roofs of buildings after bombings and reported if they saw any of the houses on fire to the fire brigades. So she went to the officer behind the desk to volunteer, and as he was taking down her information, he asked her if she had any children, to which she replied, 9, which is no in German. The officer quickly replied, "Lady, go home. You have enough to do with all those children." While my mother had a difficult time in London during the war years, it was nothing like what my father endured in Germany. Here is my father's identity card under the Nazis, which was issued in March 1939. All Jewish men were given the middle name of Israel by the Nazis, and you can see that on the right, circled on the right. I'm not sure if you can read it. And women were given the middle name of Sarah. Note the J stamped, sort of embossed on the left side of the card, which stands for Jude, or in German, Jew, in English. I'll tell you a little story about this too later. On September 1st, 1941, the Reichsminister of the Interior in Germany decreed that Jews over the age of 6 in the Greater German Reich were required to wear a yellow Star of David on their outer clothing in public at all times. The sign on the right says in German, "Whoever wears this symbol is an enemy of the people." The Nazis used this badge not only to stigmatize and humiliate Jews, but also to segregate them and to watch and control their movements. The badge also facilitated deportation. I have my father's star here with me today. And I would like, if you're interested, I will go to the back of the room when we're through here today as you're leaving. If you would like to see the actual thing, I'd be happy to show it to you. My father was eventually sent to a forced labor factory, but decided one day not to return to work because he knew that mass deportations were taking place. Instead, he went into hiding in the apartment of a Christian friend. When it became evident that this was too dangerous for both of them, my father later relocated to a tiny tool shed just outside of Berlin and 2 miles from Nazi SS headquarters. My father stayed in that tool shed with barely any food through the freezing winters in Berlin, no heat, I assure you, for nearly 3.5 years, marking off the days, months, and years on the calendar shown in the slide. He kept a razor blade in the cuff of his pants so that if he were captured by the Nazis, he would have taken his own life. His friend, who had brought him food occasionally, but was not, His friend who had brought him food when he could, but it was not only dangerous, as he would have been shot or worse for helping my father, and there was virtually no food to be found. During these years, my father left the tool shed only once, when a gigantic bomb fell very close to the shed, but failed to explode because the ground was very wet from a rainstorm the night before, and the bomb sunk into the earth. But my father was afraid it could explode at any time, so he hid in the woods nearby until that friend who brought him the food came and notified the Nazis about the bomb, and they came out and disarmed it. And when that was done, my father snuck back into that tool shed. When Berlin fell to the Russians in May 1945, my father was finally liberated. He weighed 92 pounds, having lost 55 pounds during his ordeal. One of the most chilling stories he told me was about the day he walked out of his hiding place in that little tool shed as a free man after nearly 3.5 years. As he stepped out of that tool shed, that razor blade that he kept in the cuff of his pants cut through on the bottom and dropped to the floor, to the ground as he stepped out. I don't think you could get a Hollywood movie to make a more symbolic message than that of freedom. When World War II ended in Europe in May 1945, more than 2 million Europeans were displaced, including 250,000 Jews. On December 22nd, 1945, President Truman issued an executive order to address the refugee situation in Europe after World War II. This order set forth that the immigration quotas for 1946 give preference to victims of Nazi persecution who were in the U.S. zones of occupation at the time of the executive order. There were many members of Congress at the time who opposed even the smallest number of Jewish immigrants. Anti-Semitism was rampant at the time, and this executive order was able to override the public discontent over the influx of immigrants. Imagine how many thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Jews could have been saved if the U.S. had opened their doors earlier to these desperate refugees. And so my father was able to obtain a visa and come to the U.S. in August 1946. He traveled third class on the SS Marine Marlin
Here's a photo of the ship, along with the ship's manifest with my father's name on it, which he mercifully shortened from Milshinsky to Mills. Good thing for me, huh? My mother followed from England a few months later. My mother had an uncle in Chicago, and so they decided to go there. Their reunion for the first time after 7 years of forced separation was another Hollywood moment. My dad was on a chartered bus of some kind, and he could see my mother through the window of the bus, but the immigration authorities would not let my father get off the bus to greet my mother. Instead, they made them greet each other in some sort of stage, it's probably like this, while photographers filmed photographers filmed the whole thing. I don't know what the purpose was. It was probably some sort of PR thing, but it upset my father very much. After all this time away from my mother, he was once again being put through bureaucratic hoops. It was a tough one to get out. He told my mother on that stage not to cry. He told her somewhat bitterly, "Don't give them the satisfaction." So my parents were immigrants in the U.S., new immigrants with virtually no money. They lived in what we used to call a rooming house in a poor section of Chicago. Of course, today it's a very upscale neighborhood. Those things change sometimes. My mother had learned English when she was living in London, and my father went to night school to learn English here. I came along in 1949, and so, yes, I'm able to obtain senior discounts at Harris Teeter every Thursday. I was an only child. I'd like to think they quit while they were ahead. But it really was because they had trouble conceiving me, and they were already older when they had me. My friends' parents were all much younger than my parents, but it never really bothered me. I didn't know any other kids whose parents had gone through the Holocaust, and I always knew I was a little different because of my background and because I was the child of immigrants who spoke with thick German accents. But my parents were very fortunate and adapted well to life in America, considering all they had gone through. Our small family had a simple but good life in Chicago. Eventually, my folks retired to Florida in 1978. My father passed away in 1987 at the age of 77. My mother lived to the ripe old age of nearly 104. Here she is at her birthday party, 103. She was a remarkable woman and a true survivor. Finishing up very shortly, I have one last story to tell you. A few years after my father died, my mother learned that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. was being built on the National Mall. She gathered up some of my father's papers and objects from the time he was in Germany under the Nazis and sent them to the museum. I never knew exactly what she had sent or whether they had been accepted by the museum. Fast forward to 1993. It was shortly after the museum opened, and my husband and I drove up to D.C. to see it. As I was walking along the top floor of the museum, where the exhibits are, I passed a glass wall in front of hundreds of identity cards of victims of the Holocaust. Suddenly, my eyes rested on the bottom row, and there I saw my father's picture on his identity card, the one I showed you earlier. There was a stranger standing next to me, and he saw me tense up and pointing to the card, and I said, "That's my father." I called to my husband and told him about it, and the stranger put on his glasses, and all three of us stooped down to take a closer look. It was an unforgettable moment. For the man, an absolutely amazing that I just happened to have looked and noticed that particular card among the hundreds that were there. It also happened to be my birthday that day, and I couldn't help thinking how my father's survival had brought me to that time and place. I wish now that I had asked more questions when my parents were alive. I have tried to piece together fragments of their stories to tell you today, but I know there are so many other details I've missed that I would have liked to have known. Oh, I got ahead of myself, and I also have something blocking here. So, thank you. Shoot that. Let me read these words. They're from Deuteronomy in the Bible. Only guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, and lest these things depart your heart all the days of your life. And you shall make them known to your children and your children's children. While I don't have children of my own, I'm passing on my parents' story to you today. Unbelievably, there are many misguided, ignorant individuals who, despite indisputable evidence, deny that the Holocaust ever happened. They spew their hatred on the website, social media. But I'm hopeful that everyone here knows the truth. Lastly, I'll end today with this quote, which I saw on a memorial plaque for a Jewish man killed by a terrorist in a synagogue in Copenhagen, Denmark, which my husband and I recently visited. I was very moved by this message, and I thought how relevant it was for all of us. We are never too young or too old to stand up against bullying, cruelty, discrimination, and injustice. You might think, well, what can I do? It all starts by taking this message to heart. Be kind to each other, no matter what the consequences may be. Yesterday I was watching TV, and it's The View or something, and they announced that it was National Unity Day. I thought, well, that's coincidental. And the purpose of it was to stand up against bullying and unite for kindness, acceptance, and inclusion. It seems to me that every day should be National Unity Day. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions,